Comrades, open your eyes for a moment and look beyond the polished illusions that surround you. You are told that life is a neutral struggle, that success depends solely on personal effort, that society is a field of open opportunity. But this is the first lie of the ruling class. You are already fighting a war every day, every hour, every moment. A war waged not with guns or banners, but with wages, debts, rents, inflation, and exploitation. A war invisible only because those in power have built an entire ideology to conceal it. This war is not declared on television nor recorded in the newspapers, yet it shapes every breath you take. It is the class war, a struggle in which the workers produce everything yet own nothing, while a minority commands everything yet produces nothing. And the tragedy is not that this war exists. The tragedy is that millions fight it unknowingly, unorganized, isolated, and blamed for their own chains. You rise before dawn not because you freely choose to, but because the system demands your exhaustion. You sell your labor not as a noble exchange, but because survival has been commodified. Your labor, the very essence of your life, has been turned into a profit machine for someone else. And every paycheck you receive is not a reward, but the remainder left after the capitalist has extracted your surplus value. This, comrades, is the battlefield Marx exposed in his works. The economic structure that forces the many to sustain the luxury of the few. The laborer creates wealth, the capitalist appropriates it. The worker builds society, the ruling class claims ownership. This is the foundation upon which every factory stands, every office rises, every corporation grows. And yet, you are told to be grateful. Grateful to the employer who pays you less than the value you create. Grateful to the landlord who charges you rent for land he does not cultivate. Grateful to the corporation that prices basic necessities beyond your reach, then sells you a dream of personal responsibility. This ideological fog is no accident. It is a deliberate strategy, a superstructure designed to protect the economic base of exploitation. The school teaches obedience, the media teaches resignation. Politics teaches false choices. And through this machinery, the ruling class quietly reproduces its power while convincing you that no alternatives exist. But comrades, history is not neutral. Society is not static. Power is not eternal. Every system that rises on the backs of the oppressed carries within it the seeds of its own downfall. Capitalism is no exception. Its crises, its inequalities, its relentless hunger for profit all expose its contradiction. It relies on the worker but destroys the conditions of the worker's life. This contradiction is your opening, because the ruling class, for all its wealth, for all its media, for all its institutions, lacks the one force that can reshape history: collective labor. They may own the machines, but you operate them. They may own the land, but you cultivate it. They may own the capital, but you bring it to life. Without your hands, their world collapses. This is why fear is their greatest weapon, and unity is your greatest strength. You are isolated by design, divided by race, by region, by job title, by arbitrary categories invented to mask your shared condition. But the moment workers recognize their common exploitation, the spell of capitalist ideology begins to break. The moment you see yourself not as an individual competitor, but as part of a class, the ruling order begins to tremble. Class consciousness is the beginning of liberation. Organization is its instrument. Solidarity is its heartbeat. The class war is not won in a single uprising, nor through spontaneous outrage. It is won through the building of powerful, disciplined, collective movements. Through the recognition that workers share not only the weight of exploitation but the power to overturn it. Through the understanding that history has always advanced when ordinary people, workers, laborers, the oppressed, united and transformed their conditions. Comrades, the invisible war becomes visible the moment you name it. It becomes winnable the moment you confront it. And it becomes unstoppable the moment you fight not as isolated individuals, but as a class awakened. The ruling class has its wealth, its institutions, its illusions. But you have your labor, your collective strength, your unity, your historical role as the force that builds, sustains, and ultimately transforms the world. The question before you is simple. Will you continue fighting this class war unknowingly, bleeding for a system that profits from your defeat? Or will you rise with consciousness, organize with purpose, and reclaim the dignity, power, and future that your labor has always deserved? The invisible battle is already here. The time to see it, the time to organize, is now. Every morning, as you rise before the sun has fully claimed the sky, you enter a battlefield you were never taught to see. You cross the threshold from your home into a world structured not by fairness or mutual benefit, but by a quiet, ceaseless conflict over power, wealth, and control. This is not the kind of war declared by generals or broadcast on national networks. It is a war embedded in the fabric of society itself, a class war, and you are already one of its combatants, whether you have chosen the role or not. This war does not need bullets, because it operates through wages. It does not need tanks, because it governs through ownership. And it does not need soldiers, because it recruits workers through necessity. The moment you enter the workplace, the moment you sign a contract, the moment you accept a wage that barely reflects a fraction of the value you produce, you have stepped onto the front lines of an economic struggle that shapes your entire existence. Yet the brilliance of the ruling order lies in this. It convinces you that no such war exists. It paints your daily exhaustion as personal responsibility. It portrays your stagnating wages as economic inevitability. It masks exploitation with words like opportunity, growth, and individual achievement. You are told that if you fail to escape poverty, it is because of your laziness. If you fall behind, it is because of your lack of discipline. If you suffer under rising costs and falling incomes, it is because you simply didn't work hard enough. But this narrative is not truth, it is strategy. The truth is that society is divided into two great forces. On one side stand those who own the land, factories, corporations, technologies, and resources, the minority whose power is derived from ownership, not labor. On the other side stand those who own nothing but their ability to work. They sustain every system, drive every industry, and produce the wealth of the world, yet cannot claim the fruits of their own labor. This division is not an accident of fate. It is the backbone of the economic structure. It determines who commands and who obeys. It determines who rests and who struggles. It determines who prospers and who merely survives. And because these interests are fundamentally opposed, the war between these classes is perpetual. You do not need to pick up a weapon to participate in it. Your participation is enforced by the necessity to live. The ruling class wages this war every time it lowers wages while raising profits. Every time it automates labor to eliminate workers but never reduces working hours. Every time it drives up rent while constructing nothing affordable. Every time it exploits fear to enforce obedience. Every time it convinces you that your worth is measured only by your productivity. This war is fought in the office, where workers compete against each other for promotions that only reinforce the hierarchy. It is fought in the factory, where the pace of labor accelerates while the wage remains static. It is fought in the gig economy, where workers are fragmented into isolated individuals, stripped of security, benefits, and collective power. It is fought in the marketplace, where rising prices devour your income before it ever reaches your hands. But the most dangerous battlefield is the ideological one, for the ruling class understands that material dominance is not enough. They must also dominate thought. They invest in narratives that glorify wealth and demonize poverty. They naturalize inequality. They elevate individualism. They cultivate hopelessness. And in doing so, they turn the very people who suffer under the system into defenders of the system. The tragedy is not that the war exists. The tragedy is that most workers do not realize they are fighting it alone, unprepared, unarmed, and unaware. They struggle against rising bills, impossible debts, relentless pressures, believing these hardships to be the product of personal failure rather than the consequences of a system built to extract from them. Understanding that you are already in a class war is the first act of liberation. Awareness transforms confusion into clarity. It reveals that the hardships you face are not individual burdens, but collective symptoms of a deeper conflict. It exposes the hidden structures that shape your life. And once the invisible becomes visible, the possibility of resistance emerges. You cannot choose whether you participate in this war. The system has already made that choice for you. But you can choose how you participate. You can choose consciousness over illusion. You can choose unity over isolation. You can choose organization over resignation. Only then does the class war cease to be a silent defeat and begin to tilt toward a collective victory. Every structure that stands, every machine that turns, every service that functions, every commodity that fills the shelves of the marketplace, each arises from the effort, sweat, and skill of labor. Wealth does not emerge from the pockets of the wealthy, nor from the cleverness of financiers, nor from the passive ownership of property. It emerges from the daily, disciplined activity of those who work. And yet, despite being the true creators of society's riches, workers receive only the smallest fragments of what they produce. Consider the absurdity of the world as it is arranged. The worker arrives before dawn, prepares the tools, powers the machines, organizes the materials, performs the physical and mental tasks necessary for production, and at the end of the day receives a wage that barely covers food, rent, and survival. Meanwhile, the owner, who may not even step foot inside the factory, the warehouse, or the office, claims the majority of the wealth generated. This is not a mystery. It is the logic of a system that transforms human labor into a commodity, purchased at the lowest possible price, and used to create value far greater than the cost of hiring it. The difference between what the worker produces and what the worker is paid is the source of profit. The worker creates surplus value, yet never controls it. It is siphoned upward to those who possess ownership, not skill, not productivity, but ownership. And this ownership, far from being a neutral legal arrangement, is the foundation of exploitation. The owner claims the product not because they created it, but because they own the means through which it was created. The factory, the tools, the technology, the land, the organization of production. Through this ownership, the ruling class gains the power to appropriate the fruits of labor while giving back only the minimum necessary to keep the workers alive and working. The wage appears as a fair exchange, but it is nothing of the sort. It is a disguise, a veil that hides the extraction that occurs beneath it. The worker sells labor power, time, energy, life in exchange for money. But the value created in that time far exceeds the wage. The system relies on this hidden gap. Without this theft of surplus, profit would vanish. Without this appropriation, the ruling class would have no wealth at all. This is why workers can labor more intensely than ever before, yet remain stuck in the same conditions. As productivity rises, wages do not rise with it. Machines become faster, processes become more efficient, industries become more sophisticated, yet the workers' share of the wealth shrinks. The gains of progress are captured by those who own the means of production, while the creators of that progress remain locked in the same struggle for survival. And the irony lies here. The more wealth labor creates, the more impoverished the workers become relative to the richness of the world they have built. They walk past skyscrapers they constructed yet cannot afford to enter. They manufacture technology they could never purchase. They cook meals they cannot taste. They generate profits that lift corporations to unimaginable prosperity while their own wages stagnate. Meanwhile, the ruling class indulges in the illusion that wealth is the result of personal brilliance, innovation, or entrepreneurial spirit. They claim the wealth created by workers as evidence of their own talent. But remove labor from their enterprises, and their genius collapses into dust. Remove owners from the workplace, and production continues. Remove workers, and the entire system halts. Yet even this structural truth is obscured by ideology. Workers are told to be grateful for employment, as though labor does not generate the conditions that make employment possible. They are told that wealth comes from risk-taking, as if the worker does not risk life, health, and time every day. They are told that profit is the reward for initiative, as if initiative alone could produce anything without human hands and human effort. The worker's dependency is an illusion. It is the ruling class that depends on labor, not the other way around. When workers recognize that all wealth begins with them, that society moves because they move, that value exists because they create it, the structure of exploitation becomes impossible to ignore. The inequalities of the world no longer appear natural but manufactured. The hierarchies of society no longer appear justified but parasitic. The wage no longer appears as compensation but as a mechanism of control. To understand that labor produces all wealth is to understand that the power to reshape society lies not with those who accumulate wealth, but with those who create it. And to recognize that workers receive only its fragments is to recognize the fundamental injustice around which the entire economic order is built. From this recognition arises the first spark of transformation. For those who create the world have the right and the capacity to reclaim it. The endurance of capitalism is not a miracle of efficiency, nor the triumph of innovation, nor the result of some natural order of human life. Its survival depends on something far more subtle, far more pervasive, far more insidious. Ideology, a systematic machinery of ideas designed to mask the exploitation at the heart of the system. Without this ideological veil, the contradictions of the capitalist world would be too glaring, its injustices too blatant, its inequalities too intolerable to sustain. Capitalism does not merely exploit labor. It must also conceal that exploitation. It must ensure that workers misinterpret their own condition, that they view oppression as opportunity and inequality as the inevitable expression of human difference. It must convince them that the decisions of the ruling class are natural, that the rules of the market are unchangeable, and that the system itself is the only possible way society can function. This ideological framework surrounds every worker from birth. It is taught in the classroom, broadcast in the media, embedded in laws, reinforced through culture, and repeated endlessly until the exploited accept the very logic of their own subordination. It is a fog that obscures reality, a curtain that hides the machinery behind the stage, ensuring that the social order appears not constructed but inevitable. At the core of this ideology lies the myth of individual achievement. Workers are told that success or failure is the result of personal traits, ambition, discipline, intelligence, rather than the structural forces that shape their lives. A person's wealth is presented as evidence of exceptional merit, while poverty is framed as personal inadequacy. In this way, exploitation is transformed into a moral failing of the exploited. The worker earning barely enough to survive is not seen as a victim of systemic extraction, but as someone who didn't try hard enough. This individualistic narrative is not neutral, it is a weapon. It isolates workers from one another, turning collective suffering into private shame. It prevents them from recognizing their shared condition, their common interests, and their collective strength. By fragmenting the workers into isolated competitors, ideology destroys the very consciousness necessary for transforming the system. Yet the ideological machinery goes further. It glorifies the owners of capital as visionary leaders, pioneers, and innovators, despite the fact that their fortunes are built largely on ownership rather than labor. Through media spectacles, biographies, and cultural myths, capitalists are presented not as beneficiaries of exploitation but as the heroic engines of society. Their wealth is sanitized, romanticized, and detached from its material origins in the unpaid labor of workers. At the same time, the system portrays itself as the guardian of freedom. It claims to offer choice, opportunity, and mobility, even as it confines the worker to wage dependence. The freedom celebrated is the freedom of the owner to extract, not the freedom of the worker to live without selling labor. The marketplace is portrayed as a realm of equality, where buyers and sellers meet as autonomous individuals, while hiding the immense inequality in power between those who must sell their labor to survive and those who purchase it to profit. This ideological inversion, where exploitation is disguised as fairness and domination is disguised as freedom, allows capitalism to function without constant resistance. It prevents the exploited from recognizing the system as the source of their suffering, redirecting frustration toward themselves or toward other workers. Instead of questioning the structure, people internalize its demands. The institutions that shape public consciousness play a crucial role in this concealment. The education system teaches obedience, not critique. The media focuses on individual scandals rather than structural analysis. Religion often preaches submission and patience rather than justice. Politics offers the illusion of choice between options that ultimately protect the same economic order. Through these channels, ideology becomes not an external imposition but a lived reality. The brilliance of this ideological apparatus is that it transforms the unnatural into the natural. It makes exploitation appear normal, even necessary. It makes inequality appear logical, even beneficial. It makes domination appear consensual, even desirable. But ideology cannot fully erase the contradictions of the system. Eventually, the disparity between what workers are told and what they experience becomes too wide to ignore. The rising cost of living, the stagnation of wages, the insecurities of work, the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, these realities clash with the ideological illusions. The fog begins to thin. When workers start questioning why they struggle despite working harder than ever, when they begin comparing their conditions with the vast fortunes of those who profit from their labor, when they recognize that the narratives preached to them are tools of control rather than truths of life, the ideological machinery begins to crack. And in that crack lies the possibility of awakening. For once exploitation is exposed, once the workers see through the illusions, once the veil is lifted, capitalism stands revealed, vulnerable, and unstable. Recognition becomes consciousness. Consciousness becomes organization. And organization becomes transformation. Ideology keeps exploitation alive, but only as long as workers remain unaware of its power. When the exploited finally see the system for what it is, its days are numbered. Class consciousness does not arise from textbooks or slogans. It grows out of the lived reality of workers who begin to question why their lives are shaped by exhaustion, insecurity, and struggle while others enjoy abundance without contributing a fraction of their labor. It is the moment when workers stop viewing their hardships as isolated personal failures and instead recognize them as the shared consequences of a system structured around exploitation. This awakening is not merely intellectual, it is the first spark of liberation, the turning point at which the silent suffering of individuals becomes the organized strength of a collective. For as long as workers remain unaware of their position in the social structure, they remain vulnerable to the illusions that protect the ruling class. They are led to believe that the competition between workers is natural, that the hierarchy of society is an expression of talent, and that their own limited share of wealth is the unavoidable fate of most people. But class consciousness shatters these illusions. It reveals that the working class is not a collection of isolated individuals, but a single, vast social force bound together by common conditions and common interests. This consciousness does not simply identify who suffers, it identifies why they suffer. It unmasks the economic structure that compels workers to sell their labor in order to live, while allowing others to own the tools, machines, and institutions that determine the conditions of life itself. It exposes the truth that the wealth of the ruling class is built on the labor they do not perform, and the poverty of the workers is the result of the value they do not receive. When workers recognize this dynamic, they are no longer confused by the contradictions around them. They begin to see society with clarity. The development of class consciousness is therefore a direct threat to the system that depends on ignorance. This is why the ruling class invests so heavily in distractions, myths, and divisions. They rely on nationalism to divide workers by flag, on racism to divide them by skin, on religion to divide them by doctrine, on politics to divide them by party. These fractures serve one purpose: to prevent workers from seeing themselves as a unified class with unified interests. For when workers are fragmented, they can be ruled. When workers are conscious of their solidarity, they become unstoppable. Class consciousness is not merely the awareness of exploitation, it is the realization of collective power. It teaches the worker that the struggles faced alone, low wages, long hours, insecurity, lack of control, are not personal burdens but structural weapons used against the entire class. And if the cause is collective, then the solution must also be collective. This understanding transforms passive acceptance into active resistance, resignation into resolve, and despair into determination. But this transformation does not happen automatically. It requires the worker to reject the ideological narratives that portray society as a meritocratic arena of individual advancement. It requires rejecting the notion that suffering is an indication of weakness or that wealth is proof of moral superiority. It requires recognizing that the interests of the working class and the ruling class are fundamentally opposed, and that no amount of loyalty, obedience, or personal effort can reconcile that contradiction. Class consciousness also redefines freedom. Under capitalism, freedom is reduced to the right to compete, the right to sell one's labor, the right to choose between forms of exploitation. But true freedom liberation cannot be achieved while workers remain dependent on selling their labor to survive. Liberation begins when workers recognize that the system does not serve them and cannot be reformed to serve them, because its very foundation is built on their subordination. Once class consciousness emerges, workers begin to see that their power does not lie in individual struggle, but in collective action. They realize that the infrastructure of society, the factories, the transportation systems, the energy grids, the communication networks, exists only because of their labor. They understand that the ruling class does not possess the ability to operate or sustain society without them, and this realization transforms the workers' identity from victims of exploitation into agents of change. This understanding is the first step toward liberation because it breaks the psychological chains that bind the workers to the system. Before any social transformation can occur, there must be a transformation of awareness. Workers must see themselves not as isolated competitors, but as members of a class whose unity holds the potential to reshape society. They must recognize that their liberation will not be granted from above, but must be achieved from below. When class consciousness spreads, the fog of ideology lifts. The contradictions of society become visible. The injustices become intolerable. The collective strength of workers becomes undeniable. And in this awakening, the seeds of liberation are sown not as abstract theory, but as a living force capable of overturning the old order and building a new one. Class consciousness is not the end of the struggle. It is the beginning. It is the first moment in which the working class sees itself clearly, understands its power, and prepares to claim its rightful place as the force that not only produces the world, but can transform it. The working class has always possessed the power to reshape society, yet this power lies dormant so long as it remains divided, scattered, and individualized. Capitalism thrives on this fragmentation. It thrives when workers compete against one another for wages, promotions, and survival. It thrives when each person sees only their own struggle instead of the shared conditions that bind them. But the moment workers move from isolated individuals to an organized collective, the foundations of the system tremble. For only collective action, disciplined, united, conscious, has the power to challenge the structures that keep exploitation in place. Real change has never emerged from solitary effort. The myth of the heroic individual lifting themselves above their circumstances is one of the most effective illusions the ruling class has ever produced. It reinforces the belief that success is personal, while failure is self-inflicted. But this narrative collapses under scrutiny. No individual alone can confront a system sustained by institutions, laws, ownership, and vast concentrations of wealth. The worker who stands alone stands against a force designed to overpower them. The worker who stands with millions becomes a force capable of transforming the world. The ruling class, small in number yet immense in power, maintains its dominance not through sheer strength, but through the disorganization of the majority. It knows that workers vastly outnumber the owners. It knows that every material process, production, transportation, energy, communication depends on labor. And it knows that if the working class were ever to act as one, its authority would dissolve overnight. This is why it invests so heavily in dividing workers, weakening solidarity, and discouraging collective movements. The greatest fear of the ruling class is not the anger of individuals, it is the organization of the masses. Collective action begins with awareness, but it does not end there. It requires structure. It requires discipline. It requires the creation of organizations capable of coordinating the power of millions. History shows that spontaneous outrage, no matter how passionate, eventually exhausts itself. But organized struggle, rooted in shared purpose and strategic unity, has the capacity to endure, adapt, and advance. It transforms momentary resistance into a sustained movement. This organization can take many forms. It may arise in unions, where workers band together to defend their rights and challenge exploitation in the workplace. It may emerge in political movements that seek not merely to reform the system, but to restructure it entirely. It may take shape in community assemblies, workplace councils, or mass coalitions that unite workers across industries and regions. Whatever the form, the essence remains the same. Workers realizing that their strength lies not in individual action but in collective power. Collective action also reveals a deeper truth, that the working class is the true engine of society. When workers organize and withdraw their labor, industries halt, supply chains break, profits disappear, and the ruling class loses its source of wealth. The strike, the coordinated walkout, the mass mobilization, these are not merely tactics. They are demonstrations of reality. They expose the fact that the owners depend entirely on the workers, not the other way around. In that moment, the illusion of capitalist power shatters. Organization also liberates workers from the psychological chains of helplessness. For many, the system feels immovable because they face it alone. But collective action transforms fear into solidarity, despair into determination, resentment into strategy. The worker who once believed they were powerless begins to see the immense force that emerges when millions act in unison. This transformation of consciousness is as crucial as material struggle. For a united working class becomes not only a force of resistance but a force of creation, capable of building new social structures based on cooperation, equality, and collective ownership. Yet collective action is not merely about confronting the present system, it is also about envisioning and constructing an alternative. Real change requires not only resistance to exploitation but the creation of institutions rooted in democracy, shared power, and communal benefit. Organized movements can build the foundations of a new society, one where the wealth created by labor belongs to those who produce it, where social needs take precedence over profit, and where human beings are valued for their contributions rather than their market price. The ruling class understands this potential, which is why it seeks to suppress organization at every turn. It limits workers' rights to unionize, criminalizes mass protests, controls political structures, and saturates society with narratives that portray collective struggle as dangerous or unrealistic. But these attempts at suppression reveal the truth. Collective action is the greatest threat to the existing order. If it were powerless, it would not be feared. To claim real change, structural, lasting, revolutionary workers must recognize that their strength resides not in individual effort but in collective unity. When they come together, when they organize, when they act as a class with a shared purpose, they possess the ability to dismantle the machinery of exploitation and build something entirely new. Only through organized collective action can the working class move from being exploited subjects to conscious agents of history. And only then can real, enduring, transformative change become possible. The truth revealed across every idea, every contradiction, and every hidden mechanism of society leads to one undeniable reality. The world you inhabit is not shaped by the generosity of the powerful, but by the labor of those who toil without recognition. The wealth that dazzles, the institutions that claim neutrality, the ideologies that promise freedom, all of them rest on the bent backs and calloused hands of workers who receive only fractions of what they create. You were taught to believe this imbalance is natural, inevitable, even moral. But the moment you pierce that illusion, the entire structure begins to tremble. Class struggle is not a theory, it is the living pulse of society. Whether you acknowledge it or not, you are already positioned within it. Every wage cut, every impossible bill, every hour of unpaid overtime, every promise of advancement that never arrives. These are not isolated misfortunes, but deliberate outcomes of a system designed to extract from you while concealing the extraction behind slogans of opportunity, merit, and individual responsibility. Ideology functions as the velvet glove over the iron fist, shaping your understanding so you blame yourself instead of seeing the chains wrapped around you. But once consciousness awakens, the worker is no longer an isolated figure lost in confusion. You begin to recognize your conditions not as personal failures, but as collective experiences produced by an economic structure that benefits from your division and silence. This recognition is the first moment of liberation, the instant you understand that your suffering is shared, your exploitation is organized, and therefore your response must also be organized. What appears immovable becomes suddenly fragile. What appears eternal becomes temporary. What appears natural becomes exposed as artificial. And from this awareness grows a new force, the unity of workers who refuse to accept the fragments they are given. When individuals stand alone, they are overwhelmed. But when they act together, when they understand that their collective labor is the engine of society, everything that once towered over them becomes dependent on their cooperation. The power of the worker lies not in individual strength, but in the realization that the tools, factories, offices, networks, and industries cannot function without them. The moment this unity solidifies, the foundations of exploitation begin to crack. Real change has never emerged from the goodwill of those who dominate. It has always been born from the organized resistance of the oppressed workers who refuse to be passive instruments in their own subjugation. Through collective action, the exploited transform their conditions, rewrite the social order, and reclaim what has always belonged to them: the full worth of their labor, the dignity of their lives, and control over the systems that shape their destiny. The world changes only when those who create all value rise with the clarity of their position and the determination to reshape the structures that confine them. So the conclusion is not merely a summary, it is a call to tear away the illusions that bind you, a call to see yourselves not as isolated individuals, but as the collective force that sustains society. A call to organize, unify, and confront a system that thrives on your fragmentation. Every step toward awareness is a step toward freedom. Every step toward unity is a step toward power. And every step toward action brings you closer to a world where those who produce the wealth own the future shaped by their hands. The path is clear. The moment is now. The liberation of the worker begins the moment the worker decides to stand as part of a class that refuses to be silent, invisible, or exploited any longer.